In a cozy suburban home, an adopted daughter was about to detonate her family's carefully constructed harmony. What started as a birthday celebration took a shocking turn when bitter words triggered an impossible moment. Caroline Turner wasn't your typical family outsider. For 23 years, she had navigated the space between gratitude and belonging, known for her artistic spirit and piercing honesty. When her explosive declaration met her wheelchair-bound grandmother's unprecedented response, she had no idea she was walking into a revelation that would rewrite their family history. Caroline's pain would unleash secrets spanning 3 generations, proving that sometimes the most devastating truths can become the foundation for genuine healing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Caroline's car door slammed shut with more force than necessary, the sound echoing off the quiet suburban street like a gunshot. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk, staring at the Morrison family home. Warm lights spilling from every window, the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation drifting through the evening air. Through the front window, she could see the familiar silhouettes of her adopted family moving about in animated discussion, their gestures easy and comfortable. She was 20 minutes late. Not fashionably late, deliberately late. Late enough that the initial greetings would be over, that she could slip in without the awkward spotlight of arrival falling on her. Late enough that maybe they wouldn't notice if she slipped away early too. The weight of the wrapped gift in her hands felt heavier than it should. A vintage woodworking tool she'd found at an antique shop, something she thought Robert might appreciate for his workshop. Now, standing outside the house where she'd lived for 23 years but never quite belonged, she wondered if he'd even understand the thought behind it. Caroline pushed through the front door without knocking. Family privilege, she supposed, though the word family sat uncomfortably in her chest these days. The sound hit her immediately. Michael's booming laugh, the clink of glasses, Tommy's voice rising above the rest as he launched into what sounded like another story about his latest misadventure at college. Caroline! Linda's voice carried that particular note of relief and anxiety that Caroline had learned to recognize. The sound of a woman desperately trying to hold all the pieces of her family together. "We were wondering when you'd get here. Traffic okay?" "Fine," Caroline replied, holding up the gift. "Happy birthday, Robert." Robert Morrison looked up from where he sat in his favorite recliner, a beer in his hand, and that gentle, weathered smile on his face that had always made her feel simultaneously loved and distant. "You didn't have to bring anything, kiddo. You being here is gift enough." The endearment stung in a way she couldn't explain. Kiddo? The same word he used for all of them, but somehow when it was directed at her, it felt like he was trying too hard. "Oh, this is perfect timing!" Linda bustled over, her teacher instincts on full display as she orchestrated the moment. "Michael was just telling us about the Thompson case. You know, the one in the news? Caroline, you'll want to hear this." But as Caroline looked around the room, she realized she'd already missed the setup, the context that would make Michael's story meaningful. Her brother, adopted brother, her mind corrected with familiar bitterness, was mid-sentence, gesturing with his hands in that confident way that had always come so naturally to him. So the judge looks at me and says, "Counselor, are you suggesting my courtroom operates on fairy tale logic?" Michael paused for effect, his lawyer's timing impeccable. And I said, "Your Honor, I'm suggesting that if we're going to ignore precedent, we might as well start believing in happy endings." The room erupted in laughter. Tommy nearly choked on his drink, and even Eleanor, positioned in her wheelchair near the window, chuckled with appreciation. Caroline managed to smile, but it felt like putting on a mask. She could see the shared enjoyment, the way the family moved together like a well-rehearsed orchestra, each person knowing their part. "That's our Michael," Linda said proudly, her hand briefly touching his shoulder as she passed by with a tray of appetizers. Always quick on his feet, Caroline watched her adoptive mother make her rounds, adjusting Tommy's collar with maternal fondness, asking Jessica about little Emma's latest vocabulary explosion, checking that David had enough beer. The choreography of care was beautiful and terrible to witness. When Linda finally reached Caroline, her touch was brief, perfunctory, a duty fulfilled rather than affection expressed. "Caroline, honey, there are some of those little cheese things you like on the kitchen counter." It was a kindness Caroline knew. Linda had remembered her preference for the herb crackers with brie. But somehow the gesture felt like being accommodated rather than included, like being a guest with dietary restrictions rather than a daughter. "Thanks," Caroline said, moving toward the kitchen, partly to get the food but mostly to escape the suffocating warmth of the living room. She paused in the doorway, watching as Jessica helped Tommy recreate some childhood memory involving Robert's old fishing rod and a disastrous camping trip. Their father's eyes lit up as he added details, and the three of them built the story together, each contribution sparking another memory, another shared laugh. "They do that a lot." David's voice came quietly from beside her. Jessica's husband had a way of appearing without announcement, like a gentle ghost. "The storytelling, I mean. It's like they have this shared language." Caroline glanced at him, surprised by the observation. David was usually content to listen rather than analyze, but there was something knowing in his expression. "Must be nice," she said, aiming for casual but hearing the edge in her own voice. "I imagine it is," he agreed, "though sometimes I wonder if they realize they're doing it. The excluding, I mean." The word hung between them, excluding. Caroline felt exposed, as if David had reached into her chest and pulled out the feeling she'd been carrying around all evening. All her life, really. "Caroline?" Jessica's voice called from the living room. "Come tell them about your gallery show? David was telling me you sold 3 pieces?" Caroline's jaw tightened. The gallery show had been a group exhibition at a coffee shop in the Arts District, hardly the career breakthrough Jessica was making it sound like. The sale of 3 small paintings had barely covered her materials costs, but to hear Jessica tell it, Caroline was practically the next Georgia O'Keeffe. She returned to the living room, where the family had rearranged themselves around the coffee table. Jessica patted the space beside her on the couch, and Caroline sat, immediately regretting it when she realized she was now trapped in the center of their attention. "It wasn't really a show," Caroline said. "Just a group thing. Local artists." "But still," Jessica pressed, her social worker instincts kicking in as she tried to draw Caroline into the conversation. "You're pursuing your passion. That takes courage." Tommy snorted. "Passion projects don't pay rent, though. Maybe it's time to think about something more stable? Like Michael's been saying about that paralegal position at his firm." "I'm not interested in being anyone's paralegal." Caroline cut him off, her voice sharper than she'd intended. The room went quiet for a moment. Caroline could feel them exchanging glances, that subtle family communication that happened over her head. Robert cleared his throat. "Your art is important, Caroline. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." It was meant to be supportive, she knew. But something about his tone, gentle, slightly patronizing, the way someone might encourage a child's finger painting, made her want to scream. From her wheelchair by the window, Eleanor Morrison watched the entire exchange with those sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything. At 89, her grandmother, adopted grandmother, Caroline reminded herself, was the family's unofficial historian, the keeper of stories and traditions. But lately, Caroline had noticed something different in Eleanor's gaze when it fell on her. Not pity, exactly, but a kind of recognition that made Caroline uncomfortable. "Eleanor, do you need anything?" Linda appeared with her perpetual hostess anxiety. "More water? A blanket?" "I'm fine, dear," Eleanor said, her voice still strong despite her frail body. "Just enjoying watching my family." "My family?" The words echoed in Caroline's mind. Even Eleanor, who had married into the Morrison name, seemed to claim ownership of this group in a way that Caroline never could. The conversation moved on. Tommy's latest academic struggles, Jessica's promotion at the social services office, Michael's upcoming trial. Caroline listened with the attention of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture, noting the easy way they interrupted each other, finished each other's sentences, referenced shared experiences with shorthand phrases that excluded outsiders. She was an outsider. The realization wasn't new, but sitting here in the middle of it all, she felt it with fresh clarity. These people loved her. She knew that intellectually. But love, she was learning, wasn't the same as belonging. Love could be given to a stranger. Belonging had to be earned, claimed, fought for. And Caroline was tired of fighting for something that seemed to come so naturally to everyone else. As the evening wore on, she found herself studying the family photos that lined the mantelpiece. There she was in some of them, school pictures, holiday shots, graduation photos. But even in the pictures, she could see it now. The slight distance, the way she stood just a little apart from the others, the careful smile that never quite reached her eyes. 23 years of careful smiles. 23 years of trying to prove she belonged in a place that had never quite made room for her. Not really. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like a familiar coat. Heavy, uncomfortable, but known. Caroline Turner, forever the odd one out in the Morrison family story. The daughter who kept her birth name, who chose art over stability, who asked too many questions about where she came from, and not enough about where she was going. Tonight, as she listened to her family's easy laughter and watched their comfortable intimacy, Caroline felt the familiar resentment building in her chest. But tonight, something else was building too, the dangerous conviction that maybe it was time to stop pretending. Maybe it was time to say what everyone already knew but no one wanted to acknowledge. She didn't belong here, she never had. Marcus's hand found the doorframe as he stepped through the front entrance, his weathered face scanning the room with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read family dynamics from the sidelines. The celebration was in full swing, but he caught the tail end of something. A subtle tension in Caroline's posture, the way she sat just slightly apart from the others on the couch. "Sorry I'm late," he announced, his gruff voice cutting through the cheerful chatter. Traffic was murder coming from the site. Linda immediately rushed over to greet her brother, her relief palpable. "Marcus, I was starting to worry. Let me get you a beer." Caroline watched the interaction with familiar detachment. Even Marcus, Linda's divorced brother who visited maybe 6 times a year, received a warmer welcome than she ever seemed to manage. The way Linda's face lit up, the genuine pleasure in her voice, it was the same tone she used with Michael, Jessica, and Tommy. Never quite the same with Caroline. "Hey there, kiddo," Marcus said, his attention turning to Caroline as Linda bustled away. But there was something different in his greeting, less performative than Robert's earlier attempt. More genuine recognition of who she actually was, rather than who the family needed her to be. "Uncle Marcus," Caroline replied, and for the first time that evening her smile felt real. "You look like you're having about as much fun as I expected you would," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. It was a typical Marcus comment, observational, slightly irreverent, and uncomfortably accurate. Before Caroline could respond, Tommy's voice rose above the general conversation. "Remember when we used to have those epic Monopoly tournaments? Michael would always—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes briefly meeting Caroline's before looking away. "Well, you know, back when we were kids." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but Caroline felt it like a physical blow. Back when we were kids. The casual erasure of her presence in those same childhood years was so automatic, so unconscious, that Tommy didn't even realize he'd done it. "Caroline played Monopoly too," Jessica said quickly, her peacekeeper instincts kicking in. "Remember how she always wanted to be the dog piece?" It was true, but somehow Jessica's well-intentioned correction only made it worse. The fact that her sister had to actively remember and insert Caroline into the family narrative only highlighted how naturally she'd been excluded from it. "Actually," Caroline said, her voice carefully controlled, "I preferred the boot." She watched as confusion flickered across Jessica's face. Her sister, who prided herself on knowing everyone's preferences and feelings, had gotten it wrong. Such a small thing, a game piece preference, but it felt symbolic of something larger. They thought they knew her, but they knew the version of her they needed her to be, not who she actually was. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the exchange. "Funny how memory works," he said. "Sometimes we remember what we need to remember instead of what actually happened." The comment hung in the air, loaded with meaning that Caroline wasn't sure anyone else caught. But Eleanor, still positioned by the window in her wheelchair, turned her head slightly toward Marcus, a flicker of something. Recognition? Warning? Passing across her features. "I need some air," Caroline announced, standing abruptly. The living room suddenly felt suffocating, the cheerful chatter pressing against her like a weight. She slipped through the French doors onto the back deck, where the October evening had turned crisp. The familiar yard stretched before her. The oak tree she'd climbed as a child. The garden beds Linda tended with such care. the workshop where Robert spent his weekends building furniture with meticulous precision. All of it should have felt like home. Instead, it felt like a museum of someone else's childhood. The door opened behind her, and she tensed, expecting Linda or Jessica to follow with concerned questions and gentle probing. Instead, Eleanor's wheelchair appeared in the doorway, operated by her own surprisingly steady hands. "Mind some company?" Eleanor asked, maneuvering herself onto the deck with careful precision. Caroline was too surprised to refuse. Eleanor rarely came outside anymore, claiming the weather bothered her joints. But here she was, wrapped in a thick cardigan, her sharp eyes fixed on Caroline with an intensity that was both comforting and unsettling. "You're upset," Eleanor observed. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine," Caroline replied automatically, then caught herself. "No, actually, I'm not fine. But I'm always not fine at these things, so I guess that makes me consistently fine." Eleanor's mouth quirked upward. That's quite a piece of logic. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the party drifting through the glass doors. Caroline could see her family inside. Tommy gesturing wildly as he told another story, Michael leaning back in his chair with that confident posture that came so naturally to him, Linda bustling around ensuring everyone's needs were met. "I found something," Caroline said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "A few weeks ago, I did one of those DNA test things." Eleanor went very still. "Did you?" "I have biological relatives, real ones, a half-sister in Portland, cousins in Michigan." Caroline's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "People who share my actual DNA. People who might understand why I never quite fit here." "And you think DNA determines family?" Eleanor's voice was carefully neutral. Caroline turned to face her grandmother. "Adopted grandmother," she corrected herself again. "Don't you? Look at them in there. Look at how they move together, how they share the same gestures, the same sense of humor. Michael has Robert's hands. Jessica has Linda's laugh. Tommy has both their stubborn streak." "And what do you have?" Eleanor asked quietly. The question hit Caroline like a slap. What did she have? An artistic temperament no one in the family shared or particularly understood. A restlessness that none of them seemed to feel. A constant sense of being slightly out of step with the family rhythm. "Nothing," Caroline said finally. "I have nothing of theirs." Eleanor was quiet for so long that Caroline wondered if she'd fallen asleep. But when she looked over, her grandmother's eyes were alert, focused on something far beyond the backyard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You know," Eleanor said eventually, "I've lived a long time. Long enough to see families torn apart by secrets and held together by lies. Long enough to understand that sometimes the things we think define us aren't the things that actually matter." "What's that supposed to mean?" But Eleanor didn't answer directly. Instead, she reached over and touched Caroline's hand with fingers that were surprisingly warm despite the cool air. "Some stories," Eleanor said, "take a long time to tell properly. And some truths are so big, they have to wait for the right moment to be spoken." Before Caroline could ask what she meant, the French doors opened, and Linda appeared, her face creased with worry. "Mom, what are you doing out here? It's getting cold." She hurried over to Eleanor's wheelchair. "You'll catch pneumonia." "I'm fine, Linda," Eleanor said, but she allowed herself to be wheeled back inside. Caroline remained on the deck for a few more minutes, Eleanor's cryptic words echoing in her mind. Some truths are so big, they have to wait for the right moment to be spoken. What truths? What was her grandmother hiding behind those knowing eyes? When she finally went back inside, the family was preparing to move to the dining room for dinner. Caroline took her usual spot at the table, between Jessica and the wall, where she could observe without being the center of attention. But throughout the meal, she found herself watching Eleanor, noting the way her grandmother's gaze seemed to linger on each family member as if she were memorizing them, as if she were seeing them all clearly for the first time. Or perhaps, Caroline thought with a chill she couldn't quite explain, as if she were preparing to see them differently than she ever had before. The dining room felt smaller than Caroline remembered. The familiar mahogany table that had hosted countless family meals, now seeming to trap her in its orbit of forced intimacy. Linda had outdone herself with the decorations. Autumn leaves scattered artfully between the serving dishes, candles flickering in Robert's favorite brass holders, the good china that only emerged for special occasions gleaming under the chandelier's warm light. Caroline found herself seated in her usual spot, the chair that had somehow become designated as hers over the years, not quite at the head of the table where Robert presided, not quite in the center where the family conversation naturally flowed, but tucked between Jessica and the wall where she could fade into the background if needed. "This looks amazing, Mom," Michael said, reaching for the basket of dinner rolls. "You've really outdone yourself." "Oh, it's nothing special," Linda replied, but Caroline could see the pleasure in her face at the compliment. "Just Robert's favorites. The pot roast recipe came from his mother. You know, I've been making it the same way for 30 years. "Family traditions?" Jessica said warmly, serving herself from the bowl of mashed potatoes. "Emma's gonna love learning all these recipes when she's older." Caroline watched the easy flow of conversation, the way her family members built on each other's comments, creating a tapestry of shared history and future plans. She tried to insert herself into the rhythm, but every attempt felt forced, artificial. "Remember when Caroline tried to make that pot roast for Robert's birthday a few years ago?" Tommy said with a grin. "What did you use instead of beef? Tofu?" The comment was meant to be teasing, affectionate even, but Caroline felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a punchline. Her attempt at vegetarian cooking had been a disaster, yes, but the way the family remembered it, as a quirky Caroline moment rather than a genuine effort to contribute, highlighted the gulf between intention and perception. "It wasn't that bad," she said quietly. "Oh, honey, it was pretty bad," Linda said with a laugh. "But the thought was sweet. The thought was sweet." Carolyn had heard variations of that phrase her entire life. Her art was interesting. Her career choices were brave. Her opinions were unique. Always qualifiers. Always gentle dismissals wrapped in false encouragement. Robert cleared his throat, raising his wineglass slightly. "I want to say something before we get too deep into dinner." His voice carried the authority of the family patriarch, commanding attention without effort. "Sitting here, looking around this table at all of you, I'm reminded of what really matters in life. Family. Legacy. The bonds that tie us together through good times and bad." Carolyn's grip tightened on her fork as Robert continued, his words taking on the cadence of a prepared speech. "The Morrison name means something. It represents hard work, integrity, and the kind of love that doesn't waver. Looking at Michael's success in law, Jessica's dedication to helping others, even Tommy finding his way in college, I see the values Linda and I tried to instill in all of you taking root. Each example felt like a small exclusion." Carolyn waited for her own accomplishment to be mentioned, but Robert moved on to talking about the importance of carrying forward family traditions, of maintaining the bonds that connected them all. "That's beautiful, Dad," Jessica said, reaching over to squeeze Robert's hand. "We're so lucky to have this foundation." "Speaking of foundations," Linda said, her excitement bubbling over, "I have a surprise for everyone." She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper. "I've been working on this for months. A family history project." Caroline watched with growing dread as Linda unwrapped what turned out to be a massive photo collage. Dozens of family pictures arranged chronologically from Robert and Linda's wedding day through recent holiday celebrations. The craftsmanship was beautiful, Linda's teacher instincts evident in the careful organization and labeling. "Oh my God, Mom! This is incredible!" Jessica breathed, standing to get a better look. The family crowded around the collage, pointing out favorite pictures and sharing memories triggered by each image. Caroline remained seated, her view partially blocked, but she could see enough to make her stomach clench. There she was, scattered throughout the timeline, school pictures with forced smiles, holiday photos where she stood slightly apart, birthday celebrations where her expression never quite matched the joy of the others. But what struck her most was the stark difference in quantity. Michael, Jessica, and Tommy appeared in multiple photos for every year, their lives documented with the obsessive attention of devoted parents. Caroline's presence was sparser, more sporadic, as if her life had been lived in the margins of the family story. "Look at this one," Tommy said, pointing to a picture from what must have been his 8th birthday party. "Remember how we made that epic blanket fort in the living room? And this one from the camping trip to Lake George," Michael added. "Dad, you look so young here." Caroline stared at the camping photo. She remembered that trip, the summer she was 12. She'd gotten food poisoning on the second day and spent most of the vacation in the tent, while the others hiked and fished and made memories she wasn't part of. In the photo, they looked like the perfect family unit. Robert teaching Tommy to bait a hook, Linda reading to Jessica by the campfire, Michael proudly displaying a fish he'd caught. Caroline wasn't in the frame. "Where am I in that one?" Caroline asked, her voice barely audible. The conversation stopped. Linda looked back at the photo, confusion creasing her features. "Oh, honey, you were sick that day, remember? You stayed back at camp to rest." "Right," Caroline said. "I was sick." But as she looked at the collage more carefully, she began to see a pattern. In photo after photo, she was either absent or positioned at the edge of the frame. Not deliberately excluded, perhaps, but not actively included either. The visual narrative of their family life told a story of 4 core members and 1 peripheral figure. "Caroline, you're being awfully quiet," David observed. "What do you think of Linda's project?" All eyes turned to her, and Caroline felt the familiar weight of family attention, well-meaning but somehow exhausting. She forced a smile. "It's very comprehensive." "I thought you might like this one especially," Linda said, pointing to a photo from Caroline's high school art show. "You were so proud of that painting you did of the old barn." Caroline looked at the picture, herself standing awkwardly beside her artwork, while Robert and Linda flanked her with the careful smiles of parents fulfilling an obligation. She remembered that night clearly. Her art teacher had specifically requested that families attend, and while Robert and Linda had shown up, their discomfort with the artsy crowd had been palpable. They'd stayed exactly long enough to be polite before suggesting they leave for an early dinner. "That painting was beautiful," Jessica said warmly. "Whatever happened to it?" "I sold it," Caroline replied. "At that coffee shop show I mentioned earlier." "Oh." Jessica's face fell slightly. "I would have loved to buy it. Keep it in the family. Keep it in the family." The phrase echoed in Caroline's mind as conversation moved on to other photos, other memories. Everything, it seemed, was about keeping things in the family. Traditions, recipes, stories, even Caroline's art. But what if you never felt like you were truly part of the family to begin with? Caroline's artistic temperament, Tommy was saying with fond exasperation. Always marching to the beat of her own drum. Remember when she insisted on painting her room black in high school? "It wasn't black," Caroline corrected. "It was charcoal gray." "Same difference," Tommy laughed. Mom and Dad were horrified. "We weren't horrified," Linda protested, though her smile was strained. "We just worried about the resale value." The comment landed like a small bomb in Caroline's chest. Even her teenage attempt at self-expression had been viewed through the lens of practical concerns, of maintaining the family home's market appeal, rather than honoring her need for personal space. Michael, perhaps sensing the shift in mood, cleared his throat. "You know, Caroline, there's still that paralegal position open at my firm. The pay is decent, and it would give you some stability while you figure out the art thing." The art thing. Caroline's entire passion, her identity, reduced to a phase that needed to be managed, while she pursued something more practical. "I'm not interested in being anyone's paralegal," Caroline said, her voice tight with control. "I'm just saying, having a stable income might give you more freedom to pursue your creative interests on the side," Michael continued, his lawyer's logic steamrolling over her objection. "You could treat art as a hobby until it becomes more financially viable." "A hobby." Carolyn felt something crack inside her chest. 23 years of her life, and they still saw her passion as a recreational activity, something to be indulged but not taken seriously. "Art isn't a hobby for me," she said quietly. "It's who I am." The table fell silent. Caroline could feel them exchanging those looks again. The wordless family communication that happened over her head, around her, through her, but never including her. "Of course it is, honey," Linda said in her most soothing teacher voice. "We just want you to be practical about it. You're so talented, but talent doesn't always pay the bills." "Maybe Caroline knows what she's doing," David said quietly. It was the first time all evening that someone had spoken in her defense, without qualification or condition. "We all want what's best for Caroline," Robert said, his tone carrying the finality of a patriarch ending an uncomfortable discussion. "That's what family does. We look out for each other." But as Caroline looked around the table at their concerned faces, their well-meaning smiles, their careful expressions of love and support, she felt more alone than she ever had in her life. They wanted what was best for their version of Caroline, the grateful adopted daughter who would accept their guidance, appreciate their concern, and eventually conform to their expectations. They had no idea who she actually was. And increasingly, Caroline was beginning to suspect they didn't want to know. The transition from dinner to the living room felt like a choreographed dance that Caroline had never learned the steps to. While the others moved with easy familiarity, Michael helping to clear plates, Jessica organizing the dessert service, Tommy joking with Robert about his expanding waistline, Caroline found herself once again relegated to the role of observer, watching the family machine operate around her. Linda had outdone herself with the birthday cake, a towering chocolate creation that had clearly taken hours to perfect. 65 candles flickered in the soft lighting, casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with family photos that Caroline now saw with painful clarity, the visual evidence of her peripheral status in the Morrison family narrative. "Speech time," Tommy announced, raising his beer bottle in the air. "Come on, old man, give us some wisdom." Robert waved him off with characteristic modesty, but Caroline could see the pleasure in his eyes. He loved these moments. The family gathered around him, hanging on his words, celebrating not just his birthday, but his role as their anchor, their foundation. "Before I say anything," Robert began, settling into his favorite chair with the contentment of a man surrounded by everything he'd worked to build, "I want to hear from all of you. That's the real gift, knowing what I mean to my family." The suggestion sent a flutter of anxiety through Caroline's stomach. She knew this ritual, had participated in it countless times over the years. But tonight, with the weight of the evening's accumulated slights pressing down on her, the prospect of standing up and delivering the expected words of gratitude felt impossible. Michael, ever the responsible eldest son, stepped forward first. His lawyer's training showed in the way he commanded the room's attention, his posture confident, and his words carefully chosen. "Dad, you taught me that success isn't just about what you achieve, but how you treat people along the way. Every case I win, every client I help, I carry your voice in my head, reminding me to do the right thing, even when it's not the easy thing." Michael's voice grew thick with emotion. "You gave me a moral compass I didn't even know I needed until I was old enough to see other fathers who didn't measure up to your standard." The room erupted in gentle applause, and Carolyn watched Robert's face glow with pride. This was what he lived for, the validation that his children had absorbed his values, that his legacy would continue through them. Jessica went next, her social worker's empathy evident in every word. "Daddy, you showed me what unconditional love looks like. Even when I brought home that boyfriend with the motorcycle and the tattoos, don't remind me." Robert interrupted with mock horror, earning laughter from the group. "You never made me feel judged or unsafe. You just waited for me to figure out what I needed, and you were there when I did." Jessica wiped at her eyes. "That's the kind of parent I want to be for Emma. Patient, steady, always available when your children need you most." More applause, more beaming smiles. Caroline felt her chest tighten with each word. The love in the room was genuine, the gratitude heartfelt, but it existed in a language she'd never quite learned to speak fluently. Tommy bounded forward with his characteristic energy, his toast more irreverent but no less affectionate. "Dad, you're the reason I know how to change a tire, throw a curveball, and admit when I'm wrong, though I am still working on that last one." The room chuckled. "You never made me feel like I had to be perfect. You just made me feel like I had to try." "That's a gift I'm only starting to understand now that I'm supposedly an adult." Supposedly being the key word, Michael added, earning a good-natured shove from his younger brother. Then all eyes turned to Caroline. The expectant silence felt like a physical weight, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, the wine glass in her hand trembling slightly. For a moment, she considered playing the role. She could deliver the expected speech about gratitude and love, about being lucky to be part of this family. She could smile and say the words that would maintain the evening's warm atmosphere, that would keep everyone comfortable and happy. But as she looked around the room, at their expectant faces, their confident assumption that she would conform to the family script one more time, something inside her snapped. "You want to know what Dad means to me?" Caroline's voice came out stronger than she'd expected, cutting through the comfortable atmosphere like a blade. He means constantly feeling like I have to prove I belong somewhere I was never really wanted." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth, and Linda took a half step forward as if to intervene. But Caroline was just getting started. The words she'd been swallowing for 23 years were finally forcing their way out, and she found she couldn't stop them even if she wanted to. "You want to know what this family means to me? It means sitting at this table listening to stories I'm not part of. It means watching Mom fuss over everyone except me. It means having my career called a hobby and being told I should be grateful for the opportunity to file someone else's paperwork." "Caroline." Robert's voice was pained, confused. "No, let me finish." Caroline's voice rose, fueled by years of accumulated hurt and tonight's fresh wounds. "It means looking at that beautiful photo collage and seeing exactly what I've always known, that I'm not really part of this family. I'm a guest who's overstayed her welcome. I'm the charity case you took in to feel good about yourselves." The silence that followed was deafening. Caroline could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could see the shock and hurt on every face in the room. But she couldn't stop now. The truth was pouring out of her like blood from a wound, and it felt both devastating and necessary. "I was never really family," Caroline said, her voice breaking on the words that had lived in her heart for so long. "And you know what? I'm tired of pretending otherwise." She set her wine glass down with shaking hands, prepared to grab her purse and storm out. Prepared for the hurt protestations, the tearful denials, the family chaos that would inevitably follow her explosion. What she wasn't prepared for was the sound of Eleanor's wheelchair creaking as it began to move. Carolyn turned, along with everyone else in the room, to see something impossible happening. Eleanor Morrison, who hadn't stood unassisted in months, was slowly, carefully, rising from her wheelchair. Her aged hands gripped the armrests with determination, her legs trembling but holding her weight as she pushed herself upright. The room held its collective breath as Eleanor stood fully erect, her spine straight despite her 89 years, her eyes blazing with an intensity that commanded absolute attention. "Sit down, child," Eleanor said, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Before you leave this family, there are some things you need to know." Eleanor stood in the center of the living room like an ancient oak weathering a storm, her frail frame somehow radiating strength that silenced every voice in the room. Caroline remained frozen halfway to the door, her purse clutched in white-knuckled hands, as her grandmother's piercing gaze held her captive. "You think you're the only one in this room who doesn't belong?" Eleanor's voice carried decades of buried pain. "Child, you don't know the first thing about not belonging." The family exchanged bewildered glances. Linda stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding her shock. "Mom, please sit down. You shouldn't be. I've been sitting long enough." Eleanor cut her off sharply, I've been keeping quiet long enough. 70 years of keeping secrets, and I won't sit silent for one more minute while this family tears itself apart over lies I helped create." Robert's face had gone pale. "Mother, what are you talking about?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter, edged with pain. "Mother, do you know how many nights I lay awake wondering if I had any right to that title? Wondering if love could ever be enough to bridge the gap between what is and what should have been." She turned to Caroline, her eyes softening with recognition and understanding. "You want to know about not belonging, Caroline? I was adopted too." The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Eleanor's confession seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room, leaving the Morrison family gasping in the aftermath of a truth that recontextualized everything they thought they knew about themselves. Robert was the first to break the stunned silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did you just say?" Eleanor remained standing, though Caroline could see the effort it cost her. Her grandmother's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady, carved from decades of carrying this burden alone. "I said I was adopted, Robert. Just like Caroline. Taken in by strangers during the Depression, when my birth parents couldn't feed another mouth." Eleanor's eyes never left her son's face as she continued. "And you, my dear boy, were adopted too, as a baby, when your father, my first husband, died in France." The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow. He sank back into his chair, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that looked like grief for an identity he'd never known he'd lost. "That's impossible," Linda breathed, moving protectively toward her husband. "Robert, your birth certificate, your baby pictures, were carefully arranged," Eleanor said matter-of-factly. "It was easier in those days to make such things appear official, fewer questions asked. Different times, different rules about family and belonging." Michael, ever the lawyer, found his voice first among the siblings. "But why? Why keep it secret? Why lie to us for all these years?" Eleanor finally allowed herself to sink back into her wheelchair, the effort of standing having drained more from her than she'd expected. But her voice remained strong, purposeful. "Because I lived through an era when being adopted was something to be ashamed of. When families whispered about children who weren't really theirs. When love wasn't considered enough if it didn't come with blood." She looked directly at Caroline. "I swore that no child in my care would ever feel that shame. That no one would ever question their right to belong in this family." Jessica had been quiet throughout the revelation, but now she spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "So Robert he's adopted like Caroline?" "More than that," Eleanor said, and for the first time a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Robert was adopted by me when he was 6 months old. His birth mother was my sister-in-law, who died in childbirth. His father, my first husband, had been killed in the war 3 months before Robert was born. The family absorbed this information in stages, each person processing the implications at their own pace." Caroline found herself still standing by the door, no longer planning her escape, but not quite ready to rejoin the circle either. Robert's voice, when he finally spoke, was raw with emotion. "My whole life, everything I thought I knew about myself." "You're still the same man you were an hour ago," Eleanor said firmly. "The same father, the same husband, the same person who built this family with love and determination. Nothing about who you are has changed, except your understanding of where you came from." "But it changes everything," Robert protested, running his hands through his graying hair. "My parents, my history, Your history began the day I brought you home from the hospital," Eleanor interrupted. "Your parents were the people who raised you, loved you, shaped you into the man you became. Biology is just the raw material, Robert. Love is what builds a family." David, who had been watching the family dynamics with his characteristic quiet observation, cleared his throat gently. "I think what Eleanor is trying to say is that Caroline isn't the outsider here. You all are." The statement was delivered without malice, but it landed with startling clarity. Marcus, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet throughout the revelation, let out a low chuckle. "Kid's got a point," he said, nodding toward David. "Far as I can tell, this whole family is built on adoption and choice rather than blood. Makes Caroline more Morrison than any of you realized." Tommy, still struggling to process the information, looked between Eleanor and Caroline with dawning understanding. So when I said that stuff about real siblings, I was talking about a family where nobody's actually related by blood? Not nobody, Jessica corrected gently. Michael, Tommy, and I are Robert and Linda's biological children. But Robert is my chosen son, Eleanor said firmly. Just as Caroline is your chosen sister. The difference is that Robert never knew he was chosen. Caroline has always known, and that knowledge has become a burden instead of a gift. Linda, who had been moving between shock and protective instincts, finally found her voice. Mom, I can't believe you carried this secret for so long. All these years watching Caroline struggle with feeling different, and you never said anything? Eleanor's expression grew pained. I thought I was protecting Robert. And I thought Caroline's struggles were normal adjustment issues that would resolve with time and love. I didn't realize. She looked directly at Caroline. I didn't realize how much my silence was hurting you, child. How much my secret was contributing to your pain. Caroline felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time all evening. Not tears of anger or frustration, but something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or relief. You felt it too? Caroline asked quietly. The not belonging, Eleanor nodded slowly, every day for the first few years. Even after I married Robert's father. Even after I took the Morrison name, I felt like I was playing a role I hadn't quite learned, like everyone could see through me to the truth underneath. How did it stop? Caroline's voice was barely audible. It didn't stop, Eleanor admitted. It transformed. I realized that belonging isn't something that's given to you. It's something you claim for yourself. And sometimes, the families that choose you love you more fiercely than the ones you're born into, precisely because that love is deliberate. The room fell quiet as each family member absorbed not just Eleanor's revelation, but its implications for how they understood themselves and each other. Caroline could see the wheels turning in their minds, the slow recognition that everything they'd assumed about family hierarchy and biological bonds had been built on a foundation that was far more complex than any of them had imagined. For the first time in her adult life, Caroline didn't feel like the odd one out in the Morrison family story. Instead, she felt like she'd finally found her place in a narrative that was far richer and more complicated than she'd ever dared to hope. The revelation had shifted the entire emotional landscape of the room, creating space for conversations that had been impossible just an hour before. As the initial shock began to settle, family members found themselves gravitating toward each other in new configurations, drawn by curiosity, confusion, and the tentative hope that understanding might bridge gaps that had seemed unbridgeable. Robert sat in his chair, staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Caroline watched him from across the room, recognizing something in his expression that she'd seen in her own mirror countless times. The look of someone questioning everything they thought they knew about themselves. Without really deciding to, she found herself walking over to him. It's disorienting, isn't it? She said quietly, settling into the chair Jessica had vacated. Finding out that your story isn't what you thought it was. Robert looked up at her, and for the first time in Caroline's memory, she saw vulnerability in his eyes, instead of the careful distance he usually maintained. I keep trying to remember if I ever felt different. If there were signs I missed. Maybe there were, Caroline said. Or maybe Eleanor was just better at helping you belong than anyone was at helping me. The observation wasn't accusatory, just honest, and Robert flinched as if she'd touched a bruise. Caroline, I never meant. I thought I was giving you space to be yourself. I thought if I didn't push too hard, didn't try to force you into a mold. You were protecting yourself, Caroline said, and when Robert started to protest, she held up a hand. I'm not saying it was intentional, but I think maybe you sensed something about not quite fitting, and you kept your distance to avoid feeling it. The problem was, I interpreted that distance as rejection. Robert was quiet for a long moment, processing this insight. I used to have nightmares as a child, he said finally. Dreams about being left behind, forgotten. Linda always said it was normal childhood anxiety, but now you know it might have been deeper than that, Caroline finished. Some part of you remembered being given away, even if you couldn't access the memory consciously. They sat in comfortable silence, both absorbing the strange intimacy of shared experience. For the first time, Caroline felt like she was talking to her father, rather than performing the role of grateful adopted daughter for his benefit. Across the room, Linda was engaged in her own difficult conversation with Eleanor, her voice low but intense. Caroline caught fragments. "How could you let me struggle with Caroline?" And I blamed myself for not knowing how to help her, and realized that her adoptive mother was grappling with her own guilt and confusion. Marcus, ever the outside observer, had positioned himself near enough to monitor multiple conversations while maintaining his characteristic distance. He caught Caroline's eye and raised his beer bottle in a small salute, a gesture of recognition that somehow conveyed both sympathy and approval. "I owe you an apology," Robert said suddenly, pulling Caroline's attention back to their conversation. "Not just for tonight, but for years of not seeing what you needed. For not recognizing that the very thing I was trying to protect you from, feeling different, was exactly what you needed help processing." Caroline felt something loosen in her chest. "I don't need an apology for you not being psychic, Robert. I need—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I need to know that you see me now. The real me, not the grateful adoptee you think I should be." "I'm beginning to," Robert said. "And I like what I see, even if it scares me sometimes." "Why does it scare you?" Robert considered the question seriously. "Because you're braver than I ever was. You kept your birth name, you pursued your art despite everyone's doubts. You asked hard questions about where you came from. I just accepted the story I was given and tried not to think too deeply about it." Before Caroline could respond, Jessica appeared beside them, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "I need to talk to both of you," she said, "but especially Caroline." Caroline tensed, expecting another well-intentioned but misguided attempt at family mediation. Instead, Jessica surprised her by sitting on the floor beside Caroline's chair, putting herself in the position of looking up rather than down. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about feeling like you don't belong, and I realized that I've been part of the problem without knowing it." Jessica's voice was steady, but Caroline could hear the emotion underneath. "I thought I was being inclusive, but what I was really doing was managing you, trying to smooth over the rough edges instead of acknowledging that maybe the rough edges were important." "Jess, let me finish," Jessica said. "When I corrected Tommy about the Monopoly piece, when I brought up your art show tonight, when I've tried to include you in conversations, I was operating from the assumption that you needed to be helped to fit in, rather than that we needed to make more space for you to be yourself." Caroline felt tears threaten again. "I know you were trying to help." "But help with what?" Jessica asked. "Help you become more like us? Help you want what we want? That's not love, Caroline. That's assimilation." The word hung between them, stark and accurate. Assimilation. That was exactly what the family had been unconsciously pushing for. Caroline's transformation into something that fit more comfortably into their existing dynamic, rather than an expansion of that dynamic to accommodate who she actually was. "I want to know you," Jessica continued, "not the version of you that I think should exist, but the person you actually are. Your art, your questions about your birth family, your need to keep your own name, those aren't problems to be solved. They're parts of you that make this family richer." Michael, who had been in deep conversation with Tommy near the window, approached their small group with uncharacteristic hesitancy. Would it be okay if I joined this conversation?" Caroline looked up at her oldest brother, adopted brother. She corrected herself, still adjusting to the new reality, and saw genuine uncertainty in his expression. The confident lawyer was gone, replaced by someone who seemed as lost as she felt. "Of course," she said. Michael sat on the arm of Robert's chair, creating an impromptu circle. "I keep thinking about what I said earlier. About the paralegal job. And I realize that I've been treating you like a project that needed fixing rather than a sister who had different goals than mine." "Michael. No, let me say this. I was so focused on what I thought success should look like that I never bothered to understand what success means to you. Your art isn't a hobby or a phase, it's your calling. And the fact that you've pursued it despite all of us telling you it wasn't practical, that takes more courage than anything I've ever done." Caroline looked around at the three faces surrounding her. Robert's newfound vulnerability, Jessica's determined empathy, Michael's humble recognition, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not inclusion, which had always felt conditional, but acceptance. The difference was profound. "I still don't know how to do this," Caroline admitted. "How to be part of a family when I've spent so long feeling like an outsider." "None of us do," Robert said quietly. "Turns out, we're all making it up as we go along." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of decades as she began to weave the threads of family history that had been hidden for so long. The family had rearranged themselves around her wheelchair, drawn into a circle by the gravity of her words. Even Tommy had abandoned his usual restless energy, sitting cross-legged on the floor with the rapt attention of a child, hearing a bedtime story that would reshape his understanding of the world. "It was 1934 when they brought me to the Hendersons," Eleanor began, her eyes focused on something far beyond the living room walls. "I was 7 years old, small for my age, with more bones showing than flesh. The Depression had taken everything from my birth family, their farm, their hope, and finally their ability to feed 4 children." Caroline found herself leaning forward, hungry for details that might illuminate her own experience of displacement and belonging. "The Hendersons were good people," Eleanor continued. "Childless, with a farm that was struggling but still producing enough to support one more mouth. They needed help with chores, and I needed a home. It was a practical arrangement that slowly became something more." "Did you remember your birth family?" Jessica asked softly. Eleanor's smile was tinged with sadness. "I remembered everything. My mother's hands, my father's voice, the way my baby sister would cry in the night. For months, I kept thinking they would come back for me when times got better. I saved every small treasure, a button, a pretty stone, a dried flower, thinking I would show them to my real family when they returned." The word, real, hung in the air, and Caroline felt the familiar pang of recognition. "But they never came," Eleanor said simply. "And gradually, I realized that the Hendersons were becoming real in ways that had nothing to do with blood. Mrs. Henderson taught me to bake bread, and Mr. Henderson showed me how to read the sky for weather. They celebrated my small victories and comforted my disappointments. Love, I learned, isn't something you inherit. It's something you build, day by day, choice by choice." Linda wiped at her eyes. "You never told us any of this, Mom." "Because by the time I married your father, Robert, I had decided that my story began with the Hendersons. The before was too painful, and the shame." Eleanor's voice faltered slightly. "In those days, being adopted meant there was something wrong with you. Something that made your birth family not want you. I buried that shame so deep I almost convinced myself it didn't exist." Robert shifted in his chair, his voice hoarse when he spoke. "Tell me about my adoption. Please." Eleanor's expression softened as she turned toward her son. "Your father, my first husband James, was the most gentle man I ever knew. When I told him about my past, about being given away, he held me and said that the best families were the ones that chose each other deliberately. He said he was going to love me so fiercely that I would never doubt my worth again." The room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Caroline could see the pain in Eleanor's eyes as she continued. "James shipped out to France in 1943. By then I was already pregnant, though we didn't know it yet. He died at Normandy 3 months before you were born, Robert. Never knew he had a son coming." Robert's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "And my birth mother?" "My sister-in-law, Margaret. James's younger sister." Eleanor's voice grew steady again, as if telling this part of the story was somehow easier. "She was unmarried, barely 18, with no family left except me. The birth was difficult, and she died 2 days later from complications. Her last words were asking me to raise you as my own, to give you the family name and the love she couldn't." "So you weren't just adopting a stranger's child," Michael said, understanding dawning in his voice. "You were keeping family together." "I was keeping love alive," Eleanor corrected. "Margaret entrusted me with her son because she knew I understood what it meant to be given away. She knew I would never let you feel unwanted or temporary. Marcus, who had been listening with growing emotion, spoke up from his position near the window. That's why you never told him. You were protecting him from the same shame you carried. Eleanor nodded. I thought if Robert never knew he was adopted, he would never have to question his place in the world. He would never have to wonder if he was truly wanted or just tolerated. He would belong completely, without reservation. But the secrecy backfired, Caroline said quietly. Because when I came along, feeling all those things you were trying to protect Robert from feeling, none of you knew how to help me. You couldn't recognize my struggle because you'd worked so hard to prevent Robert from having it. The insight hit the family like a revelation. Eleanor's face crumpled slightly as she absorbed the unintended consequences of her well-meaning deception. I failed you both, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. I failed Robert by denying him the knowledge of his own story, the understanding that love and choice could be more powerful than blood. And I failed you, Caroline, by staying silent when you needed to hear that you weren't alone in feeling displaced. You didn't fail anyone, David said firmly, his outsider's perspective cutting through the family's tendency toward self-blame. You made the best decisions you could with the information and social context you had. The shame you felt about adoption, the secrecy that seemed protective, those were survival mechanisms shaped by your time and circumstances. Eleanor looked at him gratefully. The world has changed since I was young. Adoption isn't the stigma it once was. Families come in all forms now, and love is recognized as the foundation rather than biology. Which is why, Marcus added, Caroline's struggle isn't about adoption itself, but about feeling like she couldn't claim her full identity within this family. She needed permission to be both Turner and Morrison, both grateful and questioning, both chosen and choosing. Caroline felt something settle in her chest as Marcus articulated what she'd been trying to express for years. I never wanted to reject this family, she said. I just wanted room to be complex within it. Eleanor reached out and took Caroline's hand. And you should have had that room from the beginning. The fact that you fought for it, that you refused to simply disappear into our expectations, shows a strength I wish I'd had at your age. Robert cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. What I don't understand is how you carried this alone for so long. All these secrets, all this history. It must have been exhausting. It was, Eleanor admitted. But tonight, watching this family tear itself apart over misunderstandings that I could have prevented, I realized that some truths are too important to keep buried. Caroline deserved to know she wasn't the only one who had ever felt displaced. You deserved to know that your capacity for love came from understanding loss. And this family deserved to know that its foundation was built on choice and commitment rather than accident of birth. The weight of generations seemed to settle over the room as Eleanor's story found its place in the larger Morrison family narrative. Caroline looked around at the faces surrounding her, each person processing not just the revelation of Robert's adoption, but the broader implications for how they understood family, belonging, and the complex interplay between love and truth. For the first time in her life, Caroline felt like she was part of a story that was big enough to contain all of her contradictions, all of her questions, all of her fierce need to belong while remaining authentically herself. The hours that followed Eleanor's revelations passed in a strange, dreamlike quality, as if the family was learning to breathe in a new atmosphere, one where old assumptions had been replaced by uncomfortable but liberating truths. The formal structure of Robert's birthday celebration had dissolved into something more organic, more honest. People moved freely between the living room and kitchen, conversations beginning and ending naturally, without the forced choreography that had characterized the evening's earlier interactions. Caroline found herself in the unexpected position of being sought out rather than accommodated. Family members approached her with genuine curiosity rather than dutiful inclusion, asking questions about her art that went beyond polite interest, wanting to understand her perspective on adoption and identity, rather than offering solutions to what they'd perceived as her problem. I want to see your paintings, Robert said as Caroline helped Linda load the dishwasher. The request surprised her, not because it was unusual for family to express interest in her work, but because of the way he asked. There was no patronizing encouragement in his voice, no careful management of expectations. Just honest curiosity about something important to his daughter. "They're mostly at my apartment," Caroline said. "But I have some photos on my phone." "No," Robert shook his head. "I want to see them properly. In person. Could I visit your studio sometime?" The offer hung between them, loaded with significance. Robert had never asked to see where she worked, where she created the art that defined so much of her identity. The studio was Caroline's most private space, the place where she was most authentically herself. "I'd like that," Caroline said, surprised by how much she meant it. Linda looked up from the serving dish she was washing, her teacher instincts evident in the way she processed this exchange. "You know, Caroline, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about feeling excluded from family stories and traditions. I want to do better, but I'm not sure I know how." The admission was vulnerable, honest in a way Linda rarely allowed herself to be. Caroline could see the effort it cost her adoptive mother to acknowledge her failures, without immediately trying to fix them. "Maybe we could start by making some new traditions," Caroline suggested carefully. "Things that include everyone's interests instead of just adapting old ones." "Like what?" Caroline thought for a moment. "Well, what if instead of just sharing childhood memories at gatherings, we also shared current projects, things we're working on or excited about? That way, it's not just about the past. It's about who we all are now." Linda's face brightened with recognition. "Like a show and tell for adults." "Exactly. And maybe I could teach some basic art techniques to anyone who's interested, not because you have to appreciate my work, but because creating things together might give us new ways to connect." The suggestion was tentative, but Linda's enthusiastic nod made Caroline's chest warm with possibility. Michael approached from the living room, his lawyer's directness tempered by newfound humility. "Caroline, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a complete reevaluation of how I've been treating you. Can we start over?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, instead of me telling you what I think you should do with your life, maybe you could tell me about what you actually are doing. Your art, your goals, your challenges. Not so I can solve them, but so I can understand them." Caroline studied her brother's face, looking for signs of the condescending advice giver she'd grown to expect. Instead, she saw genuine interest and something that looked like respect. "I'm working on a series of paintings about displacement," Caroline said slowly, testing the waters. "About what it feels like to be between worlds. Not quite belonging to where you came from, not quite accepted where you are." "That sounds profound," Michael said, "and incredibly relevant to tonight's revelations. Would you be willing to show me sometime? I'm realizing I don't know anything about contemporary art, and I'd like to learn." The conversation was interrupted by Tommy, who bounded over with characteristic energy but uncharacteristic seriousness. "Okay, so I've been thinking," he announced, "and I owe everyone an apology, but especially Caroline. I've been a complete ass about the family thing and I didn't even realize it." "Tommy," Caroline started. "No, let me say this. I used words like real family without thinking about how they sounded to someone who spent her whole life wondering if she really belongs. That was thoughtless and cruel, and I'm sorry." The apology was earnest, delivered with the same enthusiasm Tommy brought to everything else. But what surprised Caroline was what came next. "I want to learn about your birth family," Tommy continued, "not because I think they're more important than us, but because they're part of your story. And your story is important to me. If you want to search for them, or connect with them, I want to support that instead of feeling threatened by it." Caroline felt tears prick her eyes. "You wouldn't mind if I had relationships with my biological relatives?" "Why would I mind?" Tommy asked, genuinely puzzled. "You having more people who love you doesn't mean you love us less, right? After tonight, I'm starting to think family is like a network that just keeps growing instead of a closed circle that keeps other people out." Jessica, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward with her own contribution. "Speaking of networks, I've been thinking about something. What if we started doing family history research together? Not just for Caroline, but for all of us." Eleanor's story made me realize how little I actually know about our extended family, our roots. "That's a wonderful idea," Linda said warmly. "We could make it a project, gathering stories, documenting family history, maybe even creating a new photo album that includes everyone's full story. Caroline looked around at the faces surrounding her, animated, engaged, including her not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest in who she was and what she brought to the family dynamic. For the first time in her memory, she felt like she was contributing to the family conversation rather than being accommodated within it. "There's something else I want to say," Caroline said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I want to keep the Turner name. It's part of who I am, and I don't want to give it up. But I also want to be Caroline Turner Morrison. Both names, both identities, both parts of my story." The request would have been impossible to voice at the beginning of the evening, loaded as it was with implications about loyalty and belonging. Now it felt like a natural expression of the complexity that the family was learning to embrace. "Caroline Turner Morrison," Robert repeated thoughtfully. "I like it. It tells the whole story. It tells your story," Eleanor added from her wheelchair, her voice warm with approval. "And that's what matters most." David, who had been observing the family's evolution throughout the evening, raised his beer in a small toast. "To families that choose each other," he said, "and to the courage it takes to keep choosing, even when it's difficult." As glasses clinked around the room, Caroline felt something shift inside her chest. Not the desperate longing for belonging that had defined so much of her life, but something steadier and more sustainable. She was still Caroline Turner, the artist who asked difficult questions and refused easy answers. But she was also Caroline Morrison, the chosen daughter of a family that was finally learning to see her clearly. The evening wasn't ending with resolution, exactly, but with the promise of ongoing effort, with commitment to doing better, to communicating more honestly, to making space for complexity within the bonds of love. For the first time in her adult life, Caroline believed that promise might actually be kept. Eleanor, watching the family interact with new openness and understanding, allowed herself a small smile. 70 years of keeping secrets, and finally the truth had set them all free. 6 months later, Caroline arrived at the Morrison house 45 minutes early, her arms loaded with groceries, and a sense of purpose that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. The March morning was crisp with the promise of spring, and she could see through the kitchen window that Linda was already bustling around, preparing for their monthly family gathering, a new tradition they'd established after Robert's birthday revelation. These weren't obligation meals anymore, carefully orchestrated events designed to maintain family harmony through surface-level pleasantries. They were working sessions, planning meetings, celebrations of the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of chosen family. Today, they were finalizing details for Eleanor's 90th birthday party and reviewing the family history project that had become an unexpected source of connection and discovery. "Caroline!" Linda's face lit up with genuine pleasure as she opened the door. "Perfect timing. I was just thinking we needed more hands for the appetizer prep." The greeting was natural, unforced, the kind of maternal warmth Caroline had observed Linda give to her other children, but had rarely experienced herself. It still surprised her sometimes, this easy inclusion, this assumption that she belonged exactly where she was. "I brought those Mediterranean olives you mentioned," Caroline said, setting her bags on the counter, "and the good sourdough from the bakery downtown." "Wonderful. Jessica's bringing the kids early so they can help decorate, and Michael's coming straight from court. Oh, and Tommy's bringing his girlfriend. Apparently it's getting serious." Caroline smiled at the easy way Linda shared family news, including her in the flow of information without the careful management that had once characterized their interactions. These casual updates had become precious to her, evidence that she was considered a full participant in the family's ongoing story rather than a guest who needed to be briefed. "How's Eleanor feeling about the big celebration?" Caroline asked as she began unpacking groceries. "She's pretending to be annoyed by all the fuss, but I caught her making a list of stories she wants to tell. I think she's planning quite a speech." Linda paused in her chopping to look at Caroline directly. "She's especially excited about your surprise." Caroline felt a flutter of nervous excitement. She'd been working on a special project for Eleanor's birthday, a series of paintings inspired by the stories Eleanor had shared about her childhood, her first marriage, and her years of secret-keeping. It was her most personal work yet, and the first time she'd created art specifically for her family rather than for galleries or shows. "I hope she likes them," Caroline said. "They're different from my usual style." "She'll love them because they come from you," Linda said simply. "And because they honor her story in a way that shows you really heard her." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jessica, David, and their 2 children, Emma, now 4, and baby Marcus, named after his great-uncle. Emma immediately ran to Caroline, who had become her favorite aunt over the past months, largely because Caroline was the only family member who took her artistic endeavors completely seriously. "Aunt Caroline, look what I made!" Emma thrust a crayon drawing toward Caroline, a remarkably sophisticated depiction of their last family gathering, complete with stick figures that were clearly identifiable as each family member. "Emma, this is incredible," Caroline said, kneeling to examine the drawing at the child's eye level. "Look at how you captured everyone's expressions. And you put Grandma Ellie in her special chair, and you drew Uncle Tommy with his guitar. And that's you." Emma pointed to a figure holding what appeared to be a paintbrush. "You're making art while everyone talks." Caroline felt a surge of emotion at the child's observation. In Emma's 4-year-old mind, Caroline's identity as an artist wasn't separate from her identity as a family member. It was simply part of who Aunt Caroline was, as natural and accepted as Tommy's music or Michael's legal work. "Should we hang this on the refrigerator with your other masterpieces?" Caroline suggested. "Yes! And can we paint together today?" "Absolutely. I brought supplies." Jessica watched this exchange with the warm satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a relationship bloom. "You know, Caroline, Emma talks about you constantly. You've become her role model for creativity and independence." The comment pleased Caroline more than she could express. Being seen as a positive influence rather than a cautionary tale about impractical life choices felt like a fundamental shift in her family role. Robert arrived next, and Caroline noticed immediately that he looked more relaxed than she'd seen him in years. The revelation about his own adoption had been difficult to process initially, but it had also freed him from unconscious anxieties he'd carried his entire life. More importantly, it had given him a framework for understanding Caroline's struggles and a roadmap for building a genuine relationship with her. "How's the studio coming along?" he asked, giving Caroline a hug that felt natural rather than obligatory. Caroline had moved to a larger studio space 2 months ago, partially funded by increased sales but mostly supported by a family loan that Robert had offered with no strings attached. It was the first time anyone in the family had invested in her art career as a legitimate business rather than an expensive hobby. "Really good. I'm working on a new series about family mythology. How the stories families tell about themselves shape individual identity. The gallery owner thinks it could be my breakthrough work." "I can't wait to see it," Robert said, and Caroline knew he meant it. He'd become one of her most enthusiastic supporters, visiting the studio regularly and asking thoughtful questions about her creative process. Michael and Tommy arrived together, their conversation animated and inclusive in a way that would have excluded Caroline in the past but now drew her in naturally. They were debating the merits of different music venues for Tommy's upcoming gig, and Michael was offering to help with contract negotiations, not in a condescending Big Brother way, but as genuine professional support for Tommy's artistic ambitions. "Caroline, you should come to the show," Tommy said. "It's at that new place in the Arts District, right near your studio. You could invite some of your gallery friends." The suggestion was casual, but Caroline recognized the significance. Tommy was actively trying to merge their different worlds, rather than keeping them separate. Her artist friends and his musician friends, her gallery connections, and his music scene, they were all becoming part of a larger network centered around family, but extending beyond it. Marcus arrived last, carrying flowers for Linda and bearing news about the family history research that had become his unexpected passion project. "I found the Hendersons' farm," he announced without preamble. "Eleanor's adoptive family. It's still standing, about 3 hours north of here. Thought maybe we could plan a trip." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Eleanor, who had been quietly observing the family's interactions from her wheelchair, sat up straighter. "You found the farm?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Not just the farm. I found the current owners, a couple who bought it from the Henderson family in the 1960s. They have some photos, some records. They'd be honored to meet you." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Not of sadness, but of something Caroline recognized as completion. The scattered pieces of her story were finally coming together, no longer secrets to be buried, but history to be honored and shared. "I'd like that," Eleanor said quietly. "I'd like to see it again, to tell them about the little girl who found family there." "We could make it a whole family trip," Jessica suggested. "Rent a house nearby, spend a long weekend exploring the area, gathering stories." "And I could document it," Caroline added, her artist's mind already envisioning the project. Photographs, sketches, maybe even a painting series about family pilgrimage. The idea took shape organically, each family member adding details and suggestions until it became a concrete plan rather than a wistful possibility. Caroline watched the process with wonder. This was how functional families worked, she realized. Ideas emerged from genuine interest rather than obligation, and everyone's contributions were valued and incorporated. As the afternoon progressed, the family worked together on various projects with easy efficiency. Linda and Jessica coordinated party planning while David entertained the children. Michael and Tommy collaborated on a playlist for Eleanor's celebration. Robert and Marcus compared notes on genealogy research, while Eleanor shared additional memories sparked by their discoveries. Caroline moved between groups, contributing her organizational skills to the party planning, her artistic eye to decoration decisions, her research abilities to the family history project. For the first time in her life, she felt fully utilized within the family dynamic, not accommodated or managed, but genuinely needed for her unique perspective and abilities. As the day wound down and family members began to leave, Caroline found herself alone with Eleanor for a few minutes. The older woman studied her with those sharp eyes that had always seen more than they revealed. "You look different," Eleanor observed, settled, somehow. Caroline considered the comment. "I feel different, like I finally know where I stand with everyone, including myself." "And where is that?" "Right here," Caroline said simply, "not on the edges trying to prove I belong, not in the center demanding attention, just here. Part of the story without having to justify my place in it." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That's what I always hoped for you. What I should have helped you find years ago." "You helped me find it when I was ready to receive it," Caroline replied. And when the family was ready to offer it genuinely, rather than out of duty. They sat in comfortable silence, watching through the window as the rest of the family gathered on the front lawn. Robert helping Tommy load his guitar into his car, Linda hugging Jessica goodbye while Emma clung to her legs, Michael and David discussing weekend plans while baby Marcus dozed in his carrier. "They're good people," Eleanor said. "Flawed, sometimes thoughtless, but good. And they love you, not because they have to, but because of who you are." Caroline felt the truth of that statement settle in her chest. The love she'd always questioned, always tested, always found lacking, it had been there all along, waiting for the barriers of misunderstanding and assumption to be cleared away. 6 months ago, she had stood in this same living room and declared that she was never really family. Tonight, watching her chosen relatives navigate their complicated, beautiful relationships with honesty and commitment, Caroline knew with absolute certainty that she had been wrong. She had always been family. She just hadn't known how to see it yet. As the last car pulled away and Linda began turning off lights, Caroline gathered her things and prepared to leave. But instead of the hollow sadness that had always accompanied the end of family gatherings, she felt anticipation. Tomorrow, she would call Jessica about coordinating children's art classes. Next week, she would meet Robert at the studio to see her latest work. In 2 weeks, they would all gather again for Eleanor's birthday celebration. The family story continued, and for the first time in her life, Caroline knew exactly where she belonged in it. Not as the grateful outsider or the troubled adoptee or the impractical artist, but as Caroline Turner Morrison, daughter, sister, aunt, an irreplaceable member of a family that had finally learned to see her clearly and love her completely. The end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,